it came to mind what you wrote back in December of 2019 when the Bears went to the throwback uniforms, and you talked about what racial history was wrapped up in those particular uniforms. And it's a complicated legacy, and I guess let's start back then and work toward now. What would stand out to you, especially based on George Halas's outsized role in how the NFL conducted its business for so long?
Yeah, I think something that is really interesting about the Brian Flores lawsuit, and we don't have any football to watch for 2 weeks. I encourage everyone to read the law. And one of the things that stood out to me is that it is a comprehensive history of NFL racism from 1920 to 2022. I think a lot of times when people talk about racism in the past, with the NFL, with other sports leagues, anywhere, it's always, well, that's the past. That was what they were doing then. It's not what we're doing now. Something that the lawsuit shows, and I think what a lot of people know, but maybe others don't, is that there's no break line. There's no cutoff point. It's year by year, season by season, decade by decade. With regard to the Bears, they do have a complicated history. Or we say we as fans, we say we won a championship, we did well. Where are we up? Are we down? I think we need to own all parts of that identity, and so we have a bad history with race with the Bears. There are also good points as well. It's about learning the whole thing. George Halas, obviously founding father of the NFL in 1920. The Bears, though, did not have a black player until 1952. What I wrote about in 2019 was the NFL's 12-year ban on black players, 1934 to 1945. And this was a ban that was held up by owners who are still in the league right now. The Halas-McCaskey family, obviously Halas owned the Bears. You've got the Mara family with the Giants, who are one of the three-team defendants in the Flores suit. You've got the Rooney family with the Steelers, who obviously from whom the Rooney Rule comes. You've got the Bidwell family, the Cardinals. So again, there's a connective tissue that runs straight through NFL history. This isn't these issues that we're talking about now with the concussion settlement, race norming, Colin Kaepernick, coaching hiring, GM hiring. These aren't things that are of the past or of the present. They're complete. They're all the way through the timeline. When I talk about the Bears' complicated history, people point out, well, George Halas, he was a leader in racial progress. We talk about Willie Thrower, 1953, quarterback. And Willie Thrower talks about how devastated he was. He came in a game. He played one game for the Bears. He came in. He drove the Bears down to the 4-yard line in place of George Blanda. And then Halas pulled Thrower out at the 4 and ran another play, and they got the touchdown. And that was the end of Willie Thrower's NFL career. The Bears last year for Black History Month ran a story on their website talking about their, progress, Black pioneers with the Bears, and they mentioned Willie Thrower. Now, when George Halas was interviewed about this in 1953, he basically said the same thing that Willie Thrower said. He said, quote, "We had a particular play we wanted called the situation, and Thrower, who has not learned all of our offense, did not know it." George Halas, he enacted race policies as Bears owner. He also angered many white players and coaches over a variety of petty grievances. He made a lot of bad decisions at quarterback, particularly after Luckman, Lane, and Lujack. So when you look at the Willie Thrower thing, you say, all right, is this racism? Is this bad quarterbacking? Is this, petty George Halas? It's probably a mix of all three. And in order to understand the team today, the franchise, and the NFL, I think you have to be able to look with clear eyes at everything that happened, try to pick it apart, try to understand what the outcomes were and what decisions were made. So even if these people are a hero, George Halas, one of the bastions of not just Chicago Bears, Chicago sports, NFL, but of Chicago. He's someone who symbolizes Chicago. And we shouldn't be afraid to look at him with clear eyes and say, he did some things that weren't right that reverberate to this day. And that is the point of tying the past to the present. It's not about something happened back in the day. It's about something happened back in the day and continued and continued and continued and is happening now.
And it isn't just that, Jack. It's the fact that his daughter is still, at 99 years old, actively involved in running the Chicago Bears, as amazing as it sounds. And his grandson is the chairman, who just hired a black general manager, who hired a black assistant general manager, and George McCaskey, who bears the same first name, his heart appears to be, and his words often appear to be, in the right place when it comes to the right side of history.
That's correct. Now, George McCaskey is on an interesting, let's call it a 5-year at least, journey toward, I think, steering the Bears in a better direction in terms of hiring and promoting and black leadership. In 2018, he followed the lead of 5 Bears players to make the Bears the NFL's first team that maximized the league's then new social justice initiative. He gave the initiative gave $813,000 to 5 Illinois organizations. Now, $813,000, certainly a drop of the bucket for an NFL team, but we keep going. In 2019, when I wrote that story, I reached out to Bears PR and get an interview with George McCaskey. They could have definitely blown me off. Instead, he sent PDFs from the Centennial scrapbook that they had put out that year for the 100-year anniversary. And in it, they talked about the band. The book was written by Dan Pompei and Don Pearson. And in my mind, I was impressed. It said a lot more than I would have expected for a book that's sold in the team store. Then George McCaskey went and told the team about the history of the jerseys and the ban on black players, the role that the Bears played on it. And he sat in front of the camera with 5 Bears players and admitted what the team had done. And that's not just someone talking about their organization. That's someone talking about their own grandfather. I thought it was an impressive act. In 2020, he led the creation of the NFL's new Workplace Diversity Committee. In 2021, he oversaw the drafting of Justin Fields, which is the organization's first ever franchise black quarterback, where you're saying this is the guy, with all respect to Vince Evans, who had a 16 start season. They were never fully committed. He was, a later round draft pick, very different than Justin Fields. And in 2022, he actually did something that is noted in the Flores lawsuit as one of the areas of relief, which is that he empowered Lamar Campbell and Tanisha Wade in the hiring process of the team's new GM and head coach. They eventually hired Ryan Poles, the first non-white GM in team history, not counting Rod Graves in the 90s, who never had the GM title, lacked full general manager authority. So Ryan Poles would be the first non-white GM in Bears history. And their scouting department, they've got Ian Cunningham now, Champ Kelly, Charles Love. They've got Ashton Washington, who's the first woman to be a Bears scout. So the Bears are starting to facilitate this pipeline of black and female scouts and hopefully still coaches. And that's what makes its way up to the general manager position, hopefully. And so these are all good things. At the same time, the Bears had an opportunity to bring in free agent quarterbacks in 2017. Could have brought in Colin Kaepernick, chose instead to bring in Mike Glennon, Mark Sanchez, and Colin Kaepernick remains unsigned. And again, it's that nuance. I would love to know more from Mr. McCaskey about what journey he is on, because to solve these problems, it can't just be about black people answering the bell. And I think a lot of times reporters will reach out to this black coach, this black player, and say, what do you think? It's got to be about reaching out to white coaches and really ownership, team boards, That's where the conversation has to take place. So I think George McCaskey is a really interesting figure in this conversation. He has taken some real proactive steps. Not going to give him all the applause in the world for doing things I think he should do, but compared to other owners in the NFL, I think he's done some really exciting work, and I would love to hear him talk more about that.
Well, we wanted a fair and objective accounting of the Bears' history with such things. We could not have had a better guest on. Jack Silverstein, he is on Twitter at ReadJack, a Bears and Chicago sports historian. Tremendous stuff, Jack. Thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Dan. And I have to say thank you to Windy City Gridiron, who stood behind me while I published that piece 3 years ago.